Mr. President, I've come to the floor a number of times this week to talk about the trade issue, and we're now debating that legislation. I would put up this sign because it's being used by folks on our side of the aisle to talk about the importance of this agreement. It talks about a free and fair trade agreement for a healthy economy. Now, I agree we need it to be fair, and I agree that we need to expand exports. I support, for the first time in 7 years, giving the United States government the ability to knock down barriers to our farmers, our workers, our service providers, so we can get a fair shake. But we've got to be sure it's fair. And so to my colleagues who have put this sign up and then have opposed the amendment I'm about to talk about, I hope they'll focus on the fair part, as well as the expansion of trade, to make sure that it does indeed give our farmers and our workers a fair shake. There's been a lot of debate about a particular amendment. It has to do with currency manipulation. It turns out everybody's against currency manipulation. Maybe that's been an evolution, but everybody's now saying the same thing. The question is whether it should be enforceable or not. And there's been a lot of discussion on the floor here today about the amendment that I'm offering with Senator Stabenow, and frankly, there's been some misinformation out here that I'd like to clarify, if I could. First, I want to talk about what these two amendments do. They're very similar, with one exception. The amendment being offered by Senator Hatch and Senator Wyden do not include enforcement. So they say this is terrible, we ought not to have currency manipulation, but the amendment does not have the courage of its convictions. It doesn't say we should do anything about it. Here's the language. First, both have basically the same definition: targeting protracted, large-scale intervention in the exchange markets by a party to a trade agreement to gain an unfair advantage. What that means basically is people lower their currency deliberately by intervening in order to make their exports less expensive to the United States and make our exports to them more expensive. That's not fair. But basically, we both identify the same problem and ensure that we are focused on this issue of real currency manipulation. Second, the amendment that I'm offering has a specific exemption for what we call macroeconomic policy, or specifically domestic monetary policy. In other words, QE 1, 2, 3, those would not be affected by our amendment. And yet, even though the Hatch-Cornyn folks are saying they're concerned about that in our amendment, that it might affect domestic policy and monetary policy, they don't have it in their amendment. We have it in ours. So we not only define currency manipulation so that it's clear that it applies to the kinds of standards that the International Monetary Fund currently requires, by the way, to all of the countries who might be signatory to the so-called Trans-Pacific Partnership, all of them, but it also explicitly says in ours, this shall not be construed to restrict the exercise of domestic monetary policy. Therefore, ours is a stronger amendment with regard to that issue. I also noticed something about their amendments that's interesting. They say that theirs has to be consistent with the existing obligations of the United States as a member of the IMF and the WTO, the World Trade Organization. Ours says the same thing, except consistent with existing principles and agreements, meaning the other countries have to live up to their agreements also. I'm not quite sure why they don't think other countries should have to live up to their obligations, because when you sign up with the IMF and sign up with the WTO, you are required not to manipulate your currency, and yet people do it because there's no enforcement. Their amendment doesn't deal with this issue directly. Ours does. Have it be consistent with the obligations these countries have already undertaken. Finally, and of course the most important part, is the enforceability. There are 60 United States senators who in 2013 signed a letter. And the letter went to the president regarding trade agreements and currency manipulation. And it said, we need to have enforceable currency manipulation provisions. 60 senators. A number of the senators are still here in the United States Senate, of course. I think they were genuine in sending that letter. I was one of them. I certainly was. I'm also a signatory to other legislation, had been working on this issue for a long time. 10 years ago, I testified in this Congress about this very issue. But I hope that those 60 senators understand that they said they wanted it to be enforceable. Ours is enforceable. It says that it should be enforceable just like anything else, like intellectual property protection, like what the tariff level ought to be, like labor and environment standards. And it's up to the administration to determine exactly how to proceed with that. That flexibility is in here. It's a trade negotiating objective, and that's appropriate too, in my view. I'm a former U.S. trade representative. I used to negotiate these agreements. The trade negotiating objectives are something we took seriously, but we were given some flexibility. This amendment provides that flexibility. Finally, I would just say there's been a lot of discussion about a poison pill. As I have joked, this is more like a vitamin than a poison pill, because this would actually help strengthen this underlying agreement and help us to get more support for trade. The polling data on this, by the way, is overwhelming. 9 out of 10 Americans agree that we had to deal with currency manipulation. 9 out of 10. Why? Because they think it's wrong. It is wrong. So I've heard it's a poison pill, first, because it might hurt us here in the Senate. Just the opposite is true. There are senators who told me they'd like to support Trade Promotion Authority, but they need something on currency manipulation to help them get there. Is it a poison pill in the House? Well, you know what? The vote in the House apparently is tough to come by for TPA. I hope it does end up being a TPA that can pass the Senate and the House. As I said earlier, I think it's the right thing for the workers I represent to expand those markets overseas. But this will help. It won't hurt, because this, again, will give Republicans from my home state of Ohio and around the country the ability to go home and look their workers in the eye and say, you know what? We focused on the fair part here. We focused on ensuring that if you worked hard and played by the rules, you would have a chance to compete and a chance to win. Finally, they say, well, it's a poison pill because of the White House, because there was a veto threat recommended by the Secretary of the Treasury yesterday. Well, it was a recommendation. It wasn't a statement of administration policy. I would just reference the President's own statements on this. I know how he feels about it. He's against currency manipulation. In fact, he said on the floor of this Senate that he wanted to be sure and work with colleagues that any trade agreement brought before the Congress is measured not against administration commitments, but instead against the rights of Americans to protection from unfair trade practices, including currency manipulation. He said he couldn't vote for a trade agreement without enforceable practices on currency manipulation, enforcing so that the rights of Americans could be protected. So I know where the President is on it, and I hope that he will remember that this is about expanding trade, and that's good. We need to do that, but at the same time ensuring we have a more level playing field. Finally, people said, well, it's a poison pill because some of our partners in TPP don't want to have to live up to their obligations under the International Monetary Fund. Well, to my colleagues, I would just say that should concern us. The last thing we want to do is complete an agreement called the Trans-Pacific Partnership and then find out after the fact, well, guess what? All these tariffs we reduced, all these non-tariff barriers that got knocked down, they didn't matter much because these same countries decided they were going to manipulate their currency, which undoes so much of the benefit of a trade agreement. Paul Volcker, former Fed chair, has said it well, that in a week, through currency manipulation, you can undo years of benefits that come from lowering tariffs and non-tariff barriers. So it should concern us if our trading partners aren't interested. By the way, 2 of them, Japan and Malaysia, have engaged in currency manipulation in the past. Are they doing it now? In my view, no. In the IMF view, no. But they have. Japan hasn't done it since 2012, but before that, they did it over 300 times. Why the heck wouldn't we want to have a provision in here that says, you know what, I know you're not doing it now, but now that we've come up with this great agreement to expand access for American farmers and American workers and American service providers to Japan, let's be sure you don't do it in the future and undo all those gains. And why would they be worried about that? Why would they not sign up to that kind of commitment? Why wouldn't the United States sign up to it and all these other countries? Malaysia is the other country that has in the past manipulated its currency. Why wouldn't they sign up to this? If they are refusing to do so, if this is considered a poison pill for that reason, we should be worried about it. So, Mr. President, I thank you for giving me the time to clarify some of the statements that were made earlier on the floor here today. And I hope that every member of the United States Senate will decide, as they talk about the need for more enforcement, that this is exactly what we're talking about. And they will ensure that this Trade Promotion Authority, representing the views of the Congress, includes real enforcement and real help for the workers we represent.